All right, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. This is a presentation that is being brought to you today by the Ornamental Nursery Area Specialized Agents, Ornamental Nursery and Greenhouse, I should say, Area Specialized Agents, Amanda Taylor, Danny Lauderdale, and I. We put these presentations on about every 3 months for the horticulture agents so that they can learn new information. But since we had such an exciting topic and such an exciting speaker, we decided to open this up to Master Gardeners also this time around. So just wanted to say thanks to all the agents and to all the Master Gardeners who are joining us today for this webinar. If you haven't done so already, please mute yourself so that we don't hear any background noise and we can all concentrate really well on this awesome presentation. And if you have questions, you either can put them in the chat or you can hold them till after Dr. Potter's done and he can answer those at the end. And I will be posting my website in just a few minutes where Dr. Potter has put 3 PDFs for everybody to enjoy. And then the recording of this presentation will be there for 1 week. That way, anybody who missed it, or if maybe you wanted to go back again and see it, you could review it for 1 week. And with that, I'll go ahead and I will introduce our speaker today. Dr. Dan Potter is a professor of entomology at the University of Kentucky, where for 42 years, his research has informed strategies for sustainable management of pest and beneficial insects in urban landscapes. Dan is an award-winning teacher and a frequent invited speaker at scientific and industry conferences around the world. He has received national leadership awards from the Professional Land Care Network, the American Nursery and Landscape Association, the U.S. Golf Association, and other green industry organizations. And looking at that, I couldn't believe that, Entomological Society of America wasn't somebody who has given you an award. They need to get on the ball with that. There's got to be some award out there that they have for somebody of your stature, Dr. Potter. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Stacy. Actually, the ESA has, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Good. Yeah, we'll try to keep the introductions as short as possible. Good. It's a real pleasure to have this invitation to speak with your group, and I want to give my thanks to Stacy for inviting me. This has been some months in the making, and I want to talk about a topic that's controversial: bees, pesticides, and politics, which I think has both challenges and opportunities for the horticulture industries. So with that, I'm going to take it away. I'm going to be doing some teaching during this talk and also presenting some of the research that's been done in my lab over the last 15 years or so on this topic. And before I begin, I do want to give a shout out to some of our sponsors. Research is expensive. A lot of people are interested in pollinator conservation and stewardship of pesticides. And so these are some of the organizations that have helped support my research and my graduate students' work. So let's start with a true story. Early in one morning in June of 2013 at an Oregon shopping center parking lot, a group of land care professionals was called in to control aphids on linden trees. And the aphids were up in the trees and they were dripping honeydew on the cars. And of course, they arrived early in the morning to make the application of pesticide because they had to do it before the cars were there. And what they didn't notice as they made this early dawn application and then probably went off to have a cup of coffee or a waffle was that the trees were in bloom. They treated the trees with dinotefuran, neonicotinoid insecticide. And an hour or two later, when the customers began to arrive, this was what they saw. The largest native bee kill ever recorded, with thousands and thousands of dead and dying bumblebees and honeybees in the parking lot on the asphalt. So out came the cell phones, of course, and then some phone calls were made. In came the Oregon Department of Agriculture officers, the endangered species conservation biologists. You might say that all hell broke loose. It hit the local news. Actually had the wrong sort of bees on that photo. It was mostly bumblebees. Hit the national news. The fallout of this resulted in the company having to net these trees. There were dozens and dozens of linden trees, and I'm sure that this netting was very, very expensive. The idea was to keep additional bees from visiting the trees while they were still toxic. They had a memorial for the thousands of dead bees with people showing up in bee suits and picketing. Just a lot of bad publicity and a real black eye for the green industry. This incident resulted in pesticide violations. The state suspended the applicator's license after the bee deaths. It hit the national news. Ultimately, the pesticide was restricted after the bee kill. And in fact, the fallout resulted in the restriction of 18 related pesticides in the state of Oregon until the whole issue was resolved. So this was one of the incidents that sort of catapulted pesticides and bees in the urban landscape into the public view. This whole fiasco resulted from a label violation. Unfortunately, in those days, the labeling wasn't as prominent as it is today. And although it said on the label that the product is highly toxic to bees and don't apply it to plants that are in bloom, they probably simply overlooked this in the early morning. It was one of the incidents that resulted in the EPA putting a more prominent environmental hazard box with we call it the bee box on pesticide labels, so that now it would be very difficult to miss. Another black eye for the green industry was a market basket survey by a group called Friends of the Earth. And they are a political action group, sort of like Save the Whales. They did a market basket survey of flowering plants in big box garden centers. And they sent off the flowers to be analyzed for pesticide residues. And lo and behold, they found residues of neonicotinoids in many of the flowers. They put out a number of bulletins and news releases warning gardeners that the plants that they might be buying could potentially be hazardous to bees. And of course, this was bad for business. It was bad for the growers. And it really called attention to this issue. Another black eye for the industry, perhaps, or at least something that called attention to this issue, was the Organic Consumers Association organizing protests at the big box stores to stop selling plants that have been treated with neonicotinoid insecticides. So these are some of the issues that catapulted the issue of pollinator conservation into the public view. So it's worth exploring for a few minutes why all this attention on bees. Why are people being urged to swarm the EPA? Why are gardeners being warned not to buy flowering plants if they intend to plant to help bees? Why are the big box stores being picketed and petitioned to stop selling a whole class of insecticides? What challenges and opportunities does the issue pose for the horticulture industry? Certainly professional land care, the nurseries, the garden centers, but also parks, golf courses, master gardeners, and millions of home landscapes. Why do we even care about bees in the first place? And so let's talk a little bit about that. We all know you're all horticultural professionals, or at least master gardeners, that bees are very important to agriculture. The worldwide economic value of insect pollination is estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And there are lots of things that would be off the menu if it wasn't for bee pollination. These are just some of them. A few years ago, the Whole Foods Co-op, or the Whole Foods Market, wanted to publicize this issue. And so they took photographs of their produce section with all the choices consumers would have with bees. And then they removed all the products that were largely bee pollinated from their shelves. And this was a very effective way, I think, of Whole Foods Market publicizing this issue and getting on the side of bee conservation. In some parts of China, where there has been very heavy agricultural spraying, the local bee populations have been nearly wiped out. And you can go online and find striking photos of how the growers have had to compensate for this problem by hiring families and farm workers to go up into the trees and hand pollinate the fruit trees using a long bamboo pole and a shaving brush dipped into jars of apple pollen. And often they hire children to do this work because they can reach the highest branches. So we're not at this point yet in the United States, but it does publicize the fact that bees are very important to agriculture. The California almond industry alone requires the use of 1.5 million rented bee colonies per year just to pollinate this one crop. And if you look at that lower right-hand image, you can see that although there are just miles and miles of almond trees around, there's just not a lot of forage for bees other than that one crop. And so there simply aren't enough native bees around year-round to get the job done. And they have to ship in these colonies of honeybees on a rental basis to do it. We want to conserve urban bees because they pollinate our gardens and they pollinate plants that are important as food for urban wildlife. Our holly berries at Christmas time on our tables, things like our ornamental crabapple fruits are bee pollinated. And increasingly urban gardens, whether they're home gardens or community gardens, are important for food security for a lot of our urban population. And then in wild settings, it's very important that we conserve bees because they're keystone species for native biodiversity. Many of our wildflowers are bee pollinated. A lot of the seeds and the mast for wildlife are from bee pollinated plants. And so we say keystone. A keystone, of course, is that stone at the top of an arch. And if you pull it out, the whole system collapses. And so it's very important that we conserve native bees in these settings as well. What a lot of people don't realize is that there are a lot of kinds of bees other than honeybees. Honeybees, in fact, are not native, neither are chickens. Honeybees were brought here by the early colonists to North America. We estimate about 1622, so perhaps on the next set of boats that followed the Mayflower. They were brought here from Europe. Besides honeybees, we have many species of native bees in North America. These are the ones that most people don't appreciate as much as the honeybees, about 4,000 species of native bees. And many of these are familiar to those of you that are into nature, things like bumblebees, familiar to most people, but also the little pretty green sweat bees, mason bees, resin bees, leafcutter bees, mining bees. These are some examples of native bees, which are also very important as pollinators of our food crops and also our ornamental plants and a lot of our native wildflowers as well. If you're interested in learning more about bees, I don't know these authors and they don't give me a beer or anything for saying this, but this is a very nice book. I've really enjoyed it, The Bees in Your Backyard. It's beautifully illustrated. It has lots of cool information about how to make bee hotels and things like that. So it's a nice guidebook if you're interested. Again, a lot of lay people don't understand that bees and wasps aren't the same thing. They're very different in their habits and perhaps also in the hazards that they pose to urban homeowners and such. Bees are herbivores. They feed their young on pollen and nectar. They have to visit flowers in order to survive. Bees have fuzzy branched hairs that trap the pollen like little feathers or little Christmas trees. And many of them have adaptations to comb that pollen off their bodies, sort of like a cat that would be licking its fur. And so, for example, honeybees are able to load that pollen like a football player carrying a football under his arm onto their little baskets on their hind legs and carrying it back to the hive. Other bees carry the pollen on their bellies. They bring it back to the colony. They feed it to their young. Here are the baby bees in their cells. And here's a mason bee nest that's provisioned with pollen. So bees must visit flowers because their biology is intricately entwined with these floral resources. Wasps, on the other hand, are carnivores. They feed their young on meat, mostly caterpillars that they go out and catch in gardens and such. Wasps are bold, or else they have just a few sparse hairs. So they're not particularly adapted to visiting flowers. They will visit flowers to take a little carbohydrate, sort of like a 5-hour energy drink. The nectar is high in carbs and it helps them get on with their day. If you see yellow jackets visiting your Coke or your watermelon at a picnic, they're there for the carbohydrates, the energy drink. If you want to have fewer yellow jackets at your picnic, serve diet drinks. My son, when he was in the 6th grade, did that as a science project and showed that a lot of these sugar-feeding insects are not attracted to diet drinks. But anyway, if you're troubled by these types of insects, they're almost certainly wasps. Honeybees and native bees are docile, and honeybees are only going to be a hazard if their hive is threatened and you go looking for trouble. Native bees rarely sting. Most of the stings in urban settings are from wasps, yellow jackets, and most of them are invasive species. So go ahead and nuke the yellow jackets if you want to. You have my blessing, but don't blame the bees. Okay, honeybees and other pollinators are having a tough time of it recently. And the public is aware of this. It's been on the cover of Time magazine. It's been on postage stamps and the boxes of Honey Nut Cheerios and so on. So it's worth exploring why are bees struggling. We know that US beekeepers lost more than 40% of their colonies last year. And this was written in 2019, but the same is occurring today. Very high winter losses, and there are a number of reasons why honeybee colonies are struggling. Why? Well, let's explore those briefly. The number one problem facing honeybees worldwide is a parasitic mite called the Varroa mite, and it feeds like a zombie. I used to think it fed like a vampire on bee blood, but it turns out that these bees chomp on the fatty tissue. These mites feed on the fatty tissues of honeybees, all the different life stages. Here you can see them on a larva, a bee pupa, and an adult honeybee. And they will feed on the fatty tissues, weaken the bees, and also transmit deadly bee diseases. And you might think these mites are tiny, but just think of something about the size of a dinner plate feeding on your back. That wouldn't be something that would make your day go better. And then put 5 of these on your back, and you can see why these are stressing the bees. This is the number one problem of commercial honeybee hives worldwide. They don't have these bees in Australia yet, and they don't have a problem with honeybee colony decline in Australia either. Now, again, these mites transmit a number of exotic bee diseases, and there are other diseases that are not carried by the mites, but these are also stressing honeybee colonies. Here are a couple of the diseases: a deformed wing virus and a fungus that causes a diarrhea or a dysentery effect in bees. These are stressing our honeybee colonies. Here's another interesting one. As the bee colonies struggle and beekeepers lose some of their colonies, they're often tempted to take more of the honey and replace it with high fructose corn syrup. And there have been very nice, credible studies that show that honey has effects like colostrum in first milk, full of antibodies and full of vitamins and nutrients that are good for the baby. We don't feed babies on high fructose corn syrup. And it turns out that real honey boosts baby bees' immune systems, whereas high fructose corn syrup does not. And so this little kid got it right. You get more bees with real honey. And again, as we raid these colonies and take a higher percentage of the real honey, the bees are weakened and made more susceptible to the diseases. Honeybees are struggling from travel stress. And some of our bee colonies have more frequent flyer miles on them than any business traveler, except they're not usually transmitted by airplanes, but by trucks. So these are some of the commercial pollination routes in North America. And most of the commercial honeybee colonies are shipped around from north to south to maybe do cranberries or such up in Maine, and then down to Florida to do citrus, up to Michigan to do apples. In the Western US, perhaps avocados in California, and up to do apples or other fruits in Washington State, on to do sunflowers and so on. So they're being trucked around the world all the time, or around the country, crowded together on trucks where the diseases and mites can spread, stressed out. And these are other things that are contributing to honeybee colony struggles. Now, despite all of these issues for honeybees, honeybee colony numbers are stable in the US. Honeybees are not going extinct. And the reason is that they're managed as semi-domesticated livestock. So most honeybees are managed that way. Beekeepers can intensify their beekeeping practices to compensate for colony loss. It costs the beekeepers money, but honeybees are not in any danger of going extinct. Okay, so I've heard it said that, arguing to save the honeybees is a bit like arguing to save birds by conserving chickens. Honeybees are sort of the chickens of the bee world, if you will. And I love honeybees, but they're not native bees. Native bees, too, are declining in North America. And this is a problem that's a little harder to do something about. And we have plenty of credible evidence that populations of bumblebees and a lot of our solitary native bees are declining. And one of the primary reasons for that is habitat loss. And this is something that we're seeing all over the United States. We certainly see it here in Lexington, and I'm sure in North Carolina too. Most of our native bees, or at least many of them, are ground nesting species. They nest in areas like you see here, which are not particularly common anymore in urbanized settings where we have monocultures of dense turf and concrete and so on. So they're losing their habitat in that way. A lot of other native bees nest in cavities or hollow stems. And again, when you put a subdivision out there, there's a lot less goldenrod and other hollow stems for these bees to make their nests in. That's the idea of these bee hotels, using the bamboo to provide them some additional habitat. Another reason why native bees, and in fact all bees, are struggling is agricultural intensification. When we get these monocultures of corn and soybeans that go for miles around, they bloom perhaps just once a year, less varied, less nutritious pollen and nectar, and then throw in the Roundup Ready crops where all of the background weeds are being suppressed by herbicides. It's just not a lot for bees to eat in those settings. And then I don't want to downplay chronic or acute exposure to pesticides. As we saw in my first example of the massive bee kill, this is happening as well. But pesticides are not the only reason why bees are struggling. It's a perfect storm. And again, my mom gets all the magazines from the wildlife organizations, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, and so on. And a lot of the emphasis in those magazines is on pesticides. But the fact is, there's more to the picture than just that. Habitat loss, diseases, mites, climate change, stressful management, all contributing to this perfect storm. And these things interact with one another. Bees that have parasites and diseases can be more susceptible to insecticide exposure. Bees that are exposed to sublethal levels of insecticides may succumb to some of these diseases or the parasites that they would otherwise be able to sustain. So it's a little bit like having a concussion or perhaps some other severe illness. If you rest in bed comfortably and you get some remedies, you can recover. And perhaps we can view the varroa mites, the diseases, the management stress, and the habitat loss in that way. But it's harder to recover if you're being kicked in the head at the same time. And this insecticide exposures, perhaps we can view as the kicks in the head. And as professional horticultural people, we don't want to be kicking bees in the head unnecessarily. The public, again, doesn't really understand that. The neonicotinoid insecticides are the ones that are in the news. We can see advertisements like this one. It's no longer a mystery. We know what's killing the bees, italicized and underlined. And the focus is typically on this one thing. Now, that's very real. We need to understand neonicotinoids to talk about them with our stakeholders. These are a class of synthetic insecticides chemically related to nicotine. The first neonicotinoids were labeled in the early 1990s, with metocloprid labeled in 1993. These are selectively much more toxic to insects than they are to mammals, including humans. That's a good thing. It's hard to poison yourself with a homeowner neonicotinoid. And that's why they were put in so many of these homeowner products, because their intrinsic toxicity is less than something like the old Durasbans and some of the other products that we used to use. And why do we use them? Of course, we all know it's not so easy being green. They are used on lawns. They're used in the protection of birch trees from bronze birch borer. They're used against leaf miner, Japanese beetles, azalea lace bugs. And again, the feature that makes them useful is their systemic activity. Neonicotinoids are systemic. They move upward in plants, vascular systems, to all parts of the plant. And so we can control emerald ash borers under the bark or aphids up in the tree canopy without having to spray the trees. And that's an advantage to the professional land care manager. They're also relatively persistent. So we can treat an ash tree with systemic neonicotinoids and get a year's worth of protection from that application. Here we can see a golf course in Lexington, Kentucky, where these trees were treated and these other trees were not treated. The golf course superintendent specifically did not treat these trees to show the Greens Committee the benefit of the treatment. In this case, in fact, they used a different type of insecticide called emamectin benzoate, Triage. And that's also a systemic, got about 5 years protection from a single application in that case. Here's an example on a golf course with a fairway that was treated with Merit, imidacloprid, a neonicotinoid insecticide, and what happened when they didn't treat the surrounding areas. And this is what the fairways used to look like in the old days all the time, back in the days of diazinon. So from a professional standpoint, these products provide effective pest control. And they can also be more practical and in some cases less hazardous than sprays. This is not the type of setting where we want to be applying sprays due to drift hazard and things like that. We can give the tree an IV with a systemic insecticide and make a much more targeted application. And so these systemic insecticides, neonicotinoids and others, are useful for managing invasive pests like hemlock woolly adelgid, spotted lanternfly, many of our scale insects, emerald ash borer, and others. And this is why they're used by the industry. But it's undeniable that these products can be systemically transferred into pollen and nectar and can pose a bee hazard. There's no debate about that anymore. There are dozens, probably hundreds of studies now that show that at high enough dosages, neonicotinoids in pollen and nectar can kill bees outright or can impair colony function. And honeybees in particular are very complicated creatures. Bumblebees too, they communicate with their nest mates. They do dances. They have sophisticated social behavior. They have to find their way back to their nests. And if they're stoned out on sublethal dosages of neonicotinoids, they can have all kinds of problems. So we have a real quandary. This is a picture of Toledo, Ohio, a street before and after the emerald ash borer. And if I lived on this street, I don't think I would want that scene in my front yard. Obviously, it's extremely expensive to remove these types of trees, overwhelming municipal tree budgets, the property values, the loss of carbon sequestration, all the rest. Commercial insecticides, whether it was Triage or even a neonicotinoid, could save these trees, at least allow a replacement plan that would extend over some years. But all of our systemic insecticides are systemic and intrinsically bee toxic. So we get to these difficult questions. Is there an acceptable threshold for a bee hazard from insecticides? And how do we balance it against the pest management benefits? Are there best management practices we could use to safeguard bees and still get the IPM benefits? We call that integrated pest and pollinator management now, IPPM. And that's the new mandate. We also need to realize that urban landscapes are just a tiny fraction of neonicotinoid use. And this was from 2015. The purple line is Turpin landscape. So we can see that most of these products are used in field crops, but it's the urban landscapes that are in the public view. These are the low-hanging fruit in the debate about pesticides. And so we're seeing more and more of this type of thing, not only banning neonicotinoids, but along the way, banning all synthetic pesticides in the city. And that can begin to pose some problems as far as people being able to deal with some of these important pest problems. And so, again, these are important issues. They're above my pay station to solve, but we have to recognize that a lot of the growers and land care professionals sort of feel like they're between the devil and the deep blue sea. They need to manage pests, but now the mandate is also to safeguard pollinators. So that brings us to the research part of the talk. For about 10 years now, my lab has been focused on assessing insecticide hazard to urban bees from realistic applications and finding ways to reduce it. We've been trying to develop best management practices for the industry until we can replace the systemic neonicotinoids with better, safer products. And we've also been trying to use this issue to promote more sustainable landscapes. So I want to give a shout out to these 4 former graduate students whose work I'm going to be talking about during this part of the talk. And we started with the premise that hazard equals toxicity times exposure. So if we can reduce exposure of bees to hazardous substances, we can reduce the hazard. Okay, and this little analogy is we can enjoy the sun where the rays, of course, are hazardous if we use sunscreen or umbrella and reduce our exposure. So for our turf work, we've used a model system of white clover intermixed with cool season turf, because at least around here, white clover is ubiquitous in lawns. It's very hard to get rid of it, even if you try. And it's very attractive to bees, especially bumblebees. And so it's often sprayed along with the applications that are made for preventive grub control in the springtime. And we've worked with bumblebees. The reason is, first of all, they're cheaper than honeybees. They're doorstep pollinators. They're often found in people's yards and so on. They make their colonies in the soil and chipmunk burrows and things. And importantly, bumblebees overwinter as a fertilized queen. So that queen is starting her nest anew every spring. A new batch of queens starts the nest anew, and they're out foraging and starting their nest at exactly the time when the lawn care industry and homeowners are making preventive grub applications. Then that colony grows during the season. It has to reach a critical mass before it switches over to producing new queens that then overwinter. So we compared in our experiments 2 chemical classes of lawn insecticides, a couple of neonicotinoids, you see them on the left. Perhaps you're familiar with the trade names. And at the time, what was a relatively new product, acelepryn, which belongs to a different chemical class, an anthranilic diamide, has a different mode of action. We applied the treatments at exactly the time when the TruGreens and the Weedmans and the other big lawn care companies are making preventive applications to residential lawns, and also the time when homeowners are applying preventive applications if they do it themselves. So we treated the turf at label rates, watered it in the way the label says you should do it. And then after the residues had dried, we set up these open bottom cages on these stands of clovery turf. And again, this is cool season turf, tall fescue and bluegrass intermixed with Dutch white clover. We purchase the bumblebee colonies. They come in a shoebox-like hive, starting with a queen and about 20 workers. Here's the queen. And then we watched what would happen. And we're simulating an application that would maybe be made to a homeowner's lawn when they were at work and the bees are foraging. And we saw almost immediately the effects of the neonicotinoids. You can see here that within really a few days, but actually it was within a few hours, there's almost no foraging. These bees are hanging on the sides of the cage, acting drunk. And then within a few days, we're seeing high worker mortality where the neonicotinoid was applied. And that's not a surprise. It says right on the label, don't do that. Don't spray it on flowering plants that are attracting bees because it's toxic. So that was not a surprise, but it was a striking demonstration. What was new and what we learned was that acelepryn, chlorantraniliprole, the other chemistry, did not have any acute effect on the bees. And this was the first demonstration in the field that that product appears to be bee friendly, if you will. We wanted to see what would happen from the standpoint of colony reproduction. So in another experiment, we exposed the colonies to weedy treated turf for 6 days. The idea here is if the homeowner has their lawn treated on a Monday or Tuesday, they don't get around to maybe mowing it until the following weekend. Then we took these bees after a 6-day exposure and took them to a safe site, Bee Heaven, a horse farm where no pesticides are used for miles around. And they're very careful about not using pesticides on these thoroughbred horse farms. And we left the bees out there to forage for the rest of the summer. Again, a 6-day exposure, and then moved to a safe site. And we monitored these colonies throughout the growing season, weighing them, checking them out. This is Jonathan Larson when he was a PhD student doing that work. And what we saw was that the bee colonies that took that initial hit back in May, that 6-day exposure, they really struggled to grow. And you can see for 2 weeks, they really didn't grow at all. They didn't produce any workers or any new brood. And then they slowly began to recover from that hit, but they never quite caught up to the non-treated colonies or the ones that were exposed to the acelepryn, which did just fine and grew through the whole growing season. Now, a bumblebee colony has to reach a critical mass before it can switch over to making new queens. And it turned out at the end of the growing season, when we evaluated the colony health, and here we are dissecting these colonies, that the ones that have been exposed to that treated turf with a neotic way back in May never reproduced. They didn't reach the critical mass. This is the original queen that was never able to quite get a colony going. This is what we saw with the non-treated colonies and also the acelepryn ones, the ones exposed to the acelepryn treated turf. Lots and lots of new queens, healthy bumblebee colonies. You might ask, do they avoid sprayed flowers? That seems like a reasonable hypothesis. That's an easy experiment to do. You can see one of my technicians treating this field of clover and tall fescue, and then we counted bees each day for a week, who came to what plot, and the answer is no. They don't avoid the treated flowers, and we've got just as many bees foraging on the neonicotinoid treated flowers and then presumably going off to die or struggle. So that's bad news. Take home point here, direct exposure to neonicotinoid residues on flowering lawn weeds is harmful to bees. Again, it says so on the label, but this was the first field demonstration of the actual effects on the colonies. And the same would be true for dandelions. Okay, again, it's a long story, I don't have much time, but we did additional research and that work has been published. I can send you the reprints if you're interested, looking for best management practices. And one of the things we found that would greatly mitigate the hazard was to mow off or control the flowering weeds before they treat for grubs. We wanted to know, is the hazard a season-long hazard or is it a transitory hazard? And it turns out if the applicators will simply encourage the homeowners to mow their lawn before the grub treatment, or mow it for them, or mow it immediately after the treatment, the hazard is greatly abated. The residue levels in the clover that grows back after the mowing are reduced by more than 99%. So that's one best management practice. Another best management practice we found was that granular formulations are much less hazardous than the sprays. They simply don't contaminate the flower heads to the same extent. So we've been saying that if you have to use neonicotinoids, at least do these types of things. Now, it may become a moot point very soon because the EPA, partially on the basis of our data sets, which they requested, is very likely to be canceling all spray uses of imidacloprid on residential turf. And that has been proposed. I think it's in the works right now. And in addition to canceling liquid applications of merit and related compounds, they're proposing radical reductions in the rates for other neonicotinoids as well. So this scenario of spraying merit on lawns is probably, the days are numbered for that. And I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on whether you're a lawn care applicator or perhaps a bee lover, but I know that our research had a role in that decision. But importantly, we were able to identify an effective non-neonicotinoid alternative that's non-hazardous to bees, and that's acelepryn. And that's good news. And there are other new products in the same process of chemistry that are coming down the pipe. We've shared these findings with thousands of end users at field days and conferences. And again, partially in response to this research, Scotts, the largest provider of homeowner products, replaced the neonicotinoid in their best-selling GrubEx product with acelepryn. And so now homeowners have a product they can use for preventive grub control that will not pose a hazard to bees in their lawns. That's good news. We've done similar studies with woody landscape plants, and I'll sum it up quickly. Again, this work has been published. And if you're interested in the details and the data and the graphs and such, I can send you the reprints. We treated different types of woody flowering landscape plants in nursery settings and landscape settings with systemic neonicotinoids applied to the soil, and then collected the flowers, prepped the flowers, spun them out in a centrifuge. It's very labor intensive, expensive work. This is how much nectar you get from 200 to 300 flowers of a hawthorn tree, for example. And then it's very expensive to do the residue analyses. But to make a long story short, what we found with this work is that these neonicotinoids hang around in nectar and pollen of trees and shrubs a lot longer than was thought. We've detected it at bee toxic concentrations for at least a year. And so our recommendation, my recommendation, has changed from what I initially thought, and that is don't use systemic neonicotinoids on flowering bee attractive plants unless there's no other way to protect the trees or shrubs. There's no reason to treat a crabapple with a systemic neonicotinoid for Japanese beetles or tent caterpillars. We have other ways to control Japanese beetles and tent caterpillars, and flowering crabapples are very bee attractive, as you know. But with something like emerald ash borer, well, it's a largely wind pollinated tree. It will attract a few bees, but again, we get into that cost benefit business. And again, it's above my pay station to say whether it would be justified to protect these trees until we can go to a phased replacement. What are some alternatives to neonicotinoids? In addition to studying its effects on bees and insects and turf, we did an extensive study of acelepryn looking at its effects on various pests of woody landscape plants. And it turns out it's our most effective sprayable product for Japanese beetles. We get about 4 weeks residual on Japanese beetles from a single application, better than Sevin, better than Telstar. It's very effective on caterpillars of all types, including tent caterpillars, sawflies, bagworms, rose slug sawfly. So here's a bee-friendly alternative to neonics and even pyrethroids for many of these pests. But it's weak on sucking insects. It doesn't do a good job on aphids and scale insects. There are other short residual products that homeowners or professional land care managers can use that won't pose much of a bee hazard as long as they don't apply them to plants in bloom. So all the time I get the question about backyard mosquito sprays. I'll bet you do too. And those are largely done with products like Telstar, pyrethroid insecticide. And these are intrinsically bee toxic, but they're relatively short residual compared to the neonicotinoids. If you spray Telstar on a flowering plant that attracts bees, you will kill bees. So we recommend, again, best management practices. Don't treat flowering plants when making backyard mosquito treatments. But there are others that can be used that, if they're used with a little bit of common sense, can control the pests without being too much of a bee hazard. Now let's get to the positive part of the talk. Lots of folks care about pollinators, and this provides a lot of opportunities for our industry to take advantage of this issue that people care about so much for positive change. Pollinators are good for the horticulture industry. And I'm sure that in North Carolina, as we have here, there are garden centers that have pollinator days and butterfly houses, and they put pollinator-friendly plant tags in their plants and they fly off the shelves. And that's good. The Million Pollinator Garden Challenge, I'm sure you know about, from the National Pollinator Garden Network. They met and exceeded the challenge in just 3 years with millions of pollinator gardens planted by homeowners and others. The best way for us to help urban pollinators is to give them more and better food. And that's what the horticulture industry does, grows flowering plants and establishes them. So it was of interest to see what we could do with that, with some of the different components of the industry. One industry group we've worked with is the golf course industry, the U.S. Golf Association. They funded work that was done by my graduate student, Emily Dobbs, in 2014. We were the first to bring a program called Operation Pollinator to North America. It had already caught on in Europe, and we established Operation Pollinator on 6 golf courses in Kentucky. Now, the rationale for this is that a lot of golf courses are already looking to reduce the acreage of managed turf and to convert it into naturalized habitat. This is a golf course in Lexington. It's my favorite golf course, in fact. It's a links type golf course where about 70% of the golf course looks like this. Milkweed, flowers, bird boxes, bat boxes, wetlands, and the golf courses, the golfers really like this. They actually pay more to play on a golf course like this. It's great for the superintendent because they can focus their management budget on a much smaller area, and they don't have to water it, fertilize it, mow it, or treat it with pesticide. It saves them money. And although this might look ratty to an untrained eye, as soon as you put up some signs about it being wildlife habitat, the golfers get it. So we wanted to take the wildflower idea to these habitats. We established these plots using methods that were developed by the cooperators in Europe. And as entomologists, we don't know much about planting flowers, but we still had remarkable success, even though we didn't know what we were doing. And this is one of the Operation Pollinator plots we established on Lakeside Golf Course, a public golf course. This tree and that tree are the same tree. You can see the turnover in floral species. This is Lanceleaf coreopsis, and then lots of bergamot and purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans later in the growing season. Really nice. We documented 49 types of bees and butterflies visiting these plots on golf courses, including some declining bumblebee species of conservation concern. We published this work in the golf course journals and also referee journals. The CEO of Marriott Golf Courses came by and saw these Operation Pollinator plots one day. He was playing around with golf and he said, "I like it." And he decreed that all of the Marriott resort golf courses in North America would have Operation Pollinator on them. And they're in the process of doing that now. So as far as I know, it's now on more than 300 golf courses in 30 states. And I think that's a win for the golf industry and also for the pollinators. There are online resources for golf courses that want to establish this type of a program. Some of them were published by Syngenta, others by the United States Golf Association, Making Room for Native Pollinators. And again, we're proud that we were the first to actually bring this program and demonstrate it in North America. Another big project done by Bernie Mock, my former PhD student, concerned trees for bees. And this has gotten a lot of airplay. The Trees for Bees project, conducted over about 4 years. We know that a single tree or shrub can provide thousands of flowers with high quality pollen and nectar in 3-dimensional space. So even though most of the lists of pollinator friendly plants are annuals and herbaceous perennials, the trees have been largely overlooked. And there are lots and lots of lists of plants that are attractive to pollinators, as we all know, but very few of these lists are based upon any real research. They're just, somebody saw a bunch of bees on that plant and it ended up in a list. So our thought was to document this scientifically. And we looked at dozens and dozens of species of woody flowering landscape plants of great variety of form and size, 5 replicates per plant species. These were all established in-ground plants at different urban landscape sites. Most of the sites were in central Kentucky, but we had some in southern Indiana and up into the Cincinnati area as well. 373 different sample sites. And they included the types of landscapes that you see in these photos. At each site, we collected a sample of 50 bees from that particular species of plant. And we also did snapshot counts, where we counted the number of bees coming to that particular plant or planting over a certain period of time to get a measure of their relative attractiveness. And the things that we saw were evident right away. And you can see just in this particular image that different woody plants attract different bee assemblages. Here we see an assemblage of the early flowering crab apples, and it's very different from the types of bees that are attracted by, say, a fuzzy deutzia. We found through this work that flower type matters, and that shouldn't be a surprise to people who've watched horticultural plants. Open petaled flowers like prairie rose, extremely attractive to bees and valuable. But our double petal hybrid tea roses, where we've replaced the floral resources with extra sets of petals, not attractive to bees and pretty useless for them. Now, I mean, that's maybe good news because people that treat their hybrid tree roses for Japanese beetles and aphids and such, that's really not much of a bee hazard in that case. Within the same genus of plants, great variation, open flowered varieties like Hydrangea paniculata, where the fertile flowers are available to the bees, can be very bee attractive, whereas other hydrangeas like the Annabelle hydrangeas that are covered with sterile sepals, not very bee attractive at all. They're still nice plants, they just don't attract a lot of bees. This is a question we get all the time. Are natives best for bees? And I don't even have to begin to tell you about this native plant movement, the controversy. It's very, very important in the horticultural industry. And Doug Tallamy is right. Native plants do support more native caterpillars that are co-adapted to feed on the leaves of those plants. And so if you want to feed the birds with caterpillar prey, go native. But not every plant has to serve every purpose. Not, in my view, not every plant has to feed the birds. So this was an important question. What about pollinators? And what we found was that non-native plants can also be very attractive to pollinators and have high quality pollen and nectar. So across the 79 or so species of plants we sampled, we see some native plants that are not very attractive to bees and some that are real bee magnets, like a winged sumac. We see non-native plants that have the same range. Some of our non-native plants are very attractive to bees. And so we can't put them all in one basket. These are some examples of highly attractive to bees native plants. I don't expect you to remember these, but I do want you to see the variety of form and color. A lot of these are great plants. Some of them are underrepresented in our landscapes, but these are all very bee attractive native plants. But here's some very bee attractive non-native plants. This is a Hegan cherry, similar to the cherries that are on the National Mall in Washington. And those are bee attractive too. Now they're non-native, but I'd suggest maybe we don't need to cut them down on the National Mall. These are other non-native plants that are very attractive to bees. Examples of native shrubs that are attractive to bees. And I'm going to talk about a list in just a minute, so don't write them all down, but you can see the variety of form and color. Some great plants, but here are some non-native shrubs that we found are very bee attractive as well. And so again, we can't generalize. Another question we got, okay, Potter, well, maybe they're attractive, but what if that nectar and pollen from the non-native plants is junk food? What if it's toxic and no good? So my student, Bernie Mock, did look at this. She looked at a sample of a variety of native and non-native plants, and we found that their pollen and nectar was similarly suitable for native bees and honeybees. Both can provide quality food for bees and other pollinators. So, and this is just an illustration of that. This is a 7 sunflower tree that grows outside of our building. And I took these pictures in September, covered with honeybees. that are just nectaring up late in the summer. There were dozens and dozens of bumblebee queens fattening up for the winter on this 7th sunflower. And I counted a dozen monarch butterflies nectaring on this 7th sunflower tree on their way back to Mexico. So I think the insects are telling us that the nectar from this non-native tree is perfectly okay with them. Many of the best bee magnet trees are also nearly pest-free. And that's really good news. We need to stop planting so many boxwoods and azaleas and other bug magnets and start to plant bee magnets instead that are relatively pest-free. And I'm an entomologist, and I can't think of hardly any pests that attack any of these, and they're very nice landscape plants. So what my advice is to people that want to know how to help the bees is to plant a diversity of flowering plants, including woody plants. Sure, emphasize native plants. Don't ever plant invasive species. We're not talking about invasives, but it's okay to put some non-invasive exotics into a landscape as well. And they help to fill in the seasonal gaps in floral resources. The reason is that a lot of these non-native plants, they retain the flowering phenology of their natal regions, which are often earlier or later than our North American plants. So something like Cornelian cherry dogwood blooms very early in the spring, helps to support a lot of our early season native bees, as well as honeybees. Lots and lots of native plants bloom in the spring and summer. And then some of these non-native, like 7th sunflower and Glossolabilia, bloom later in the year than many of our natives do, and they can be great for bees as well. Again, so it's sort of like choose some from column A, column B, and column C, and fill in your gaps and provide overlapping floral resources throughout the growing season. We've published some of this work on lists. This is one from the Horticultural Research Institute. It's a little bit out of date. We've sampled additional plants besides the ones on this list, but I sent this to Stacy and it's available to you. It's also available as a free download. We have put a couple of podcasts on the Grow Plant Health Exchange, basically this talk, Woody Plants for Urban Bee Conservation, and also a really nice talk on how to build a better monarch butterfly garden by one of my PhD students, Adam Baker. That's a talk for another day on how to build a better monarch butterfly garden. And then there's another one, a newer one, with annual and perennial plants. These are herbaceous plants for pollinators, so check those out. They're free views. And then this is another great bulletin that I sent to Stacy, published by a variety of my colleagues. I'm not on this one, which it has a lot of best management practices for protecting pollinators while treating pests in the urban landscape. It's a really great resource. Okay, so again, opportunities. Marketing opportunities for growers and retailers. I have a set of these tags in my office. The plants fly off the shelves, as you know, when they're identified as pollinator friendly. This is great for the industry. I came across this website one day last winter, Rockbridge Trees, and this particular grower has a whole bunch of web pages on trees for bees with pictures and a little bit of information about the kinds of bees that they support. I was pleased to see that he had read our work, and part of his website was based upon some of that research. And he tells me that this is a really good way for him to market some of his bee-friendly plants. Another thing we can do is encourage clover in low input turf. And again, this is a whole different talk. We're doing research on microclover lawns and such, but white clover, Dutch white clover, although it's not a native plant, is ubiquitous in urban landscapes. It's extremely attractive to bees and produces high quality pollen and nectar, especially for honeybees and for bumblebees. It can provide stepping stones between remnants of natural habitat. This is a road median next to our football stadium on campus, covered with white clover. And we want to encourage this. There's no need to spray that out. And if it's a backyard, heck, it's probably fine. We recorded more than 50 species of pollinators foraging on dandelions and clover in Lexington, Kentucky lawns and municipal parks, residential lawns. This paper has been very widely cited. I think it's been, the #1 paper ever in the Journal of Insect Conservation on social media. And there's probably people that are tweeting it to their neighbors to get off their backs about their weedy lawns and such. I don't know. But anyway, these are very valuable resources for bees. So my wife and I were traveling in Scotland some years ago before COVID, and we came upon this little backyard with the pretty white flowers in it. And it turns out that this is a view out the backyard from the bedroom of Her Majesty, the Queen of England, at Balmoral Castle. And I would argue that if little white flowers in the backyard are good enough for Her Majesty, they ought to be okay for the average American backyard. So a few take-home points. Bees are important and they benefit agricultural, urban, and wild habitats in many ways. Bees and wasps are not the same. Bees are good. Yellow jackets, maybe not so much. Bees are threatened by a variety of stressors, a perfect storm, not just pesticides, but other things as well. But we don't want to be kicking you in the head with dumb pesticide applications that expose them unnecessarily. Bee-friendly land care is good for the horticultural industry. Bee kills are bad for the horticultural industry, for everyone, top to bottom in the industry. And so we need to be working with our growers and our land care industry to educate them about this. They need to read and follow the labels and to use products that are less bee toxic whenever possible. My recommendation is to diversify urban landscapes with pest-resistant flowering plants that don't need to be treated. Go ahead and emphasize natives, but it's okay to include some non-invasive, and I emphasize non-invasive exotics, which can help to feed the bees by filling in seasonal gaps in floral resources. Now, in my lifetime, we've seen enormous changes in our attitudes about environmental conservation. When I was a kid, we threw wrappers out the car window and we didn't recycle our cans, and we did all kinds of things that we don't do today. And these images are iconic images that have created a great deal of social change and awareness. And I think that the monarch butterflies and the bees are also very powerful symbols, icons of environmental conservation that can drive positive social change. I think by harnessing public empathy for bees and other pollinators, we can use this issue as an industry to help to turn scenes like the ones on the left into scenes like the ones on the right. That's good for the environment, it's good for the horticultural industry, and it's also good for the pollinators. So with that, I'm right about on time, a little bit over, which I apologize for, but I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll see, those of you that have hung in here with me, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Or comments. You don't have to necessarily agree with me.
We did have a couple of questions. You already answered one of them, which was, what do the mosquito folks usually use?
Yeah,
And
the big issue. Unfortunately, and my brother, Michael Potter, is a national expert on urban entomology, the structural side and so on. He tells me that there really are no effective backyard mosquito products other than the pyrethroids. Yeah, we can put mosquito dunks in the bird bath with BT israeliensis, and there are things we can do, you know, from a standpoint of not allowing standing water and stuff. But when you're talking about a service industry that goes into people's backyards and sprays for mosquitoes, it's pretty much pyrethroids, and those are toxic to bees. So worlds are colliding here, you know, and I don't know where one person's right to have a backyard where their kids can play without being clobbered by Asian tiger mosquitoes. I don't know where that right ends, and somebody else is right who, you know, is helping to save the pollinators next door. I don't know where that right begins. It's a very difficult question. The best we can do right now is to encourage them to not spray flowering plants. Don't do it on windy days, and communicate with their neighbors if they're beekeepers.
great suggestions. The next question is there any info on the efficacy of the new product, Aceleprint?
Any info on the new product, Aceleprint?
On the
Well,
efficacy of it, like how well it works on the Japanese beetles and the other scarab grubs?
It's fantastic on scarab grubs as long as they eat it. It's the best product we have for grubs, no question about it. And it goes down on a very, very low rate, and it's essentially non-toxic to vertebrates. It doesn't even have a signal word on the label. So if I'm treating, if I'm treating my lawn for grubs, or if my neighbors have a bunch of little kids and they want to treat their lawn for grubs, I recommend GrubX from Scott's with acelepryn because of the favorable toxicology profile. Now, it has absolutely taken over the golf industry. They get season-long protection from grubs and also caterpillars, cutworms, armyworms, and sod webworms. So it's a very, very effective product. It will go off patent soon. Now, it's for the life of me, I have no idea why Syngenta hasn't put it in a homeowner product yet, a sprayable product. They haven't. So to me, it's nuts that we don't have a rose spray containing acelepryn. We should, but that's marketing. That's marketing. I think you will see that soon.
Next question
Anyway,
was, oh,
yeah.
sorry.
And you know, they're not buying me a beer or anything for saying that. It's a revolutionary product. You know, even Syngenta describes it as we found a unicorn at the end of a rainbow.
So the next question is, do you see resistance developing in some of the targeted insects? And so I'm assuming that she's asking about, you know, the pests that.
Yeah. The answer to that, that's a great question. We get it all the time. No. You know, outdoor landscapes are very different settings than greenhouses, where we're hammering the same population over and over and over again with chemicals. Scarab grubs are univoltine. They have one generation a year. So there's not a lot of genetic turnover during a year. You know, we're not putting that much selection on the population. And then there's always outcrossing. I mean, what percentage of lawns in a neighborhood are actually treated for Japanese beetle grubs? It's pretty small. And so just like with the farmers that use BT crops, we have natural outcrossing with susceptible populations. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that our scarab populations, like white grubs, are resistant to acelepryn. And even on golf courses where they've used merit, imidacloprid, for 20 years or more. In fact, it's almost 30 years now. I don't know that they've documented any resistance to imidacloprid in the grub populations. I think it's because that they're not treating everywhere and there's a lot of outcrossing.
The next question was about getting the web address for those recordings that you mentioned, and I'm gonna get that from you,
Sure.
Dr. Potter, and put that on my
Okay.
website. And
Yeah.
I did post my website in the chat so people can go to that. Keep going down. What about fungicides? Are they toxic to pollinators?
Some of them are. And this is outside of my wheelhouse of expertise, but I have been tracking the literature, and there's an increasing amount of evidence that there can be synergy between insecticides and fungicides. The combination, for example, in apple orchards, where they're applying combination of fungicides and insecticides at the same time, these can be synergistic in some cases. I'm not aware any of the turf fungicides that are necessarily a hazard to bees, but again, I'm not necessarily an expert on that as well. I would be careful with fungicides. Some of them do have insecticidal activity.
The next question is, can we receive a recording? And I am recording this and will be making it available for 1 week after I get it all processed and everything. And for Master Gardeners, I will send that out through your Master Gardener email chains, and for horticulture agents, I'll send that out through our horticulture agent network.
I saw a question pop up about backyard mosquito spraying and a person not seeing honeybees in their backyard since the neighbors are spraying for mosquitoes. And again, I'm just one little old professor sitting in Kentucky. I don't know that I'm ready to take on the entire national mosquito spray industry, not at age 69 anyway. It is an issue, and but Asian tiger mosquitoes are an issue too. And I can barely have I have 4 little granddaughters under the age of 6, and when they visit my house and they want to go in the wading pool, they're covered with mosquito bites. So far, I haven't treated my backyard, but I've been tempted. And again, you can't always get what you want. The best I can do is to try to urge the mosquito control industry to try to be careful, but I don't know. That one's above my pay station. What do you all think? Should it be banned?
That's definitely a tough one.
It's a tough one. It is.
So our next question is how to change people's mindset on the perceived dangers of pollinator stings.
Yeah, again, that's more for a psychologist, I suppose, than for me, but it's real. I mean, there are people who are allergic to bees, and I don't know that they would want a clover lawn. If you have 4 little granddaughters like I do that run around barefoot, you might not want them stepping on bumblebees when they're in the backyard. So we have to be reasonable. One size doesn't fit all. But the fact is that most, if you have a flowering cherry outside the front door, those bees are not going to attack you. They're not in attack mode. When bees are foraging on flowering plants, they're locked on that. Their little brains are pretty simple, and they're very single-minded about what they're doing. When I lead our insect walks at our arboretum, a lot of times I'll pet the bumblebees. I'll reach out and I'll say, let me pet this bumblebee. And my guests are horrified, but I'll stroke the bumblebee like I would a dog. And then she just go on, keep doing her thing, Now, if you go and shake a honeybee colony, they're not aggressive, but they are defensive. They're going to defend their young. So, I just think we have to educate people and acknowledge that there are people that are afraid of bees, and maybe bee-friendly plants aren't for them. But most of our stings are yellow jackets.
Okay, and so the next question is, do you know if Gainesway Horse Farm uses herbicide to keep their pasture so green, and how do herbicides affect pollinators? I have a horse pasture that is 95% weeds, but I'm really concerned about spraying anything on it.
I'm almost certain that our horse farms in Kentucky do not use herbicides in their pastures. They are extremely concerned about any chemicals being used around the horses for the politics of liability. And there's just no way they're treating those pastures with herbicides, in my view. What they are doing is cultivating thick, tall fescue that's relatively resistant to the weeds. I'd be happy for the person who asked the question. I have some contacts on the horse farms, and I can ask what they do as far as weed management and find out and get back. So if somebody wants to drop me an email, Stacy has my email, but it's University of Kentucky Entomology. I'll ask my most knowledgeable horse farm managers how they're dealing with that issue. I don't think they're using any fungicides there either. They're extremely careful.
Great, and I'm putting my email address in the chat here. So Susan Yost, if you would email me, I would then be able to email you back and get
I
you that information.
I will follow up. I'm going up to Ohio to visit Davy Tree Company tomorrow, but early next week I'll follow up with horse farm managers and try to get a better answer for that. But the answer is I would be extremely surprised if they're spraying anything on their pastures at all.
So the next question says, I live on a golf course and I cannot control what my neighbors use on their yards. Do I still want to attract pollinators to my yard?
Yeah, I think that's probably fine. It's a hard one. If your neighbor is an idiot and they're hosing down their flowering plants with neonicotinoids or pyrethroids, and you happen to lure a few bees to your property and then they fly over to your neighbor, maybe you're creating an ecological trap. I don't know, but a golf course is not usually a bit much of a bee hazard. And I do, teach the golf industry, and golf courses don't have a lot of flowering plants out in their turf. They don't want clover and dandelions on golf courses. It's usually grass monoculture. They do use a lot of herbicides on golf courses. And so we don't see a lot of honeybees and bumblebees foraging on the treated parts of the golf course. Now, the non-treated parts, the naturalized roughs, the secondary rough that might be full of clover, that's not being treated. So that shouldn't be a hazard in your backyard at all. I don't think golf courses are really the problem. Commercial lawn care and mosquito spraying, I think, is the big hazard in the urban landscape.
The next question is, what opportunity for bee-friendly habitats along national interstate highways?
Well, that's another really interesting one. Everybody likes to see the flowering plants along the interstate, the milkweeds and the butterfly habitats and the flowering plant leaf coreopsis and stuff. There is a legitimate scientific debate about whether that's doing more harm than good. I mean, it's certainly raising public awareness of pollinators, but there are scientific articles about how many dead monarchs there are on the interstate from being hit by the trucks. And the monarchs use the interstates as flyways then. I don't know whether conserving bees along the exit on I-75 is really helping the bees. It's hard to say. Where does the public awareness education and the potential road hazard to the bees? Not only that, but of course you have heavy metals and ozone and other pollutants that may make a flower that's next to an interstate less than ideal as food. So that's a tough one. I don't think there's been enough research on that. Certainly, I think there's a lot of legitimate emphasis on putting pollinator habitat in rights of way, underneath wires, corporate landscapes. Like I say, I'm going up to Davey Tree tomorrow afternoon, and they're turning their whole corporate landscape into a lot of pollinator habitat. That's good. I mean, there's not going to be any inordinate hazard there. But whether you should put a milkweed on a roadside or not, personally, I don't think so. It's just my opinion. It would be better off to have it a little off the roadside.
So what is the best way to start a conversation with neighbors and landscape businesses to find out if they're using harmful pesticides in their yards?
I don't know. You're all master gardeners. Stacy, how do you do that? Start the conversation.
That's tough.
My neighbors maybe don't like me anyway. I don't know. If I complain about their parking in front of my driveway or something. That's a tough one. I mean, as an educator, I give talks at the Arboretum. We have an urban forestry initiative on campus, and I've given basically a version of this talk to that. It's open to the public. Gave a talk at our Arboretum. I gave a talk at the North Carolina Arboretum on this topic at the public library. So baby steps, trying to educate people. Obviously, the horticulture industry is doing a good job with promoting pollinator-friendly plants and things. But, I've met people, including some of my colleagues in North Carolina State, who have really gotten angry at me for suggesting that people shouldn't have a monoculture lawn covered with pesticides. It's like, you have no right, that's, if I want to drive a Humvee that gets 2 miles to the gallon, that's my business. And don't tell me what to do. So, I mean, I think, if I preach, you probably notice that I'm trying to be nuanced in this topic. And I'm trying not to say all pesticides are bad and they should be banned. Because if I say that to the horticultural industry, especially the land care industry, they're just going to turn me off. They're going to say, well, he's just a social activist that doesn't understand our industry or what we do. And we're not going to attend any more of that guy's talks. and so, you do have to try to recognize that there are plenty of small business owners that take care of trees and shrubs and lawns that are also environmentalists and parents and good citizens, and just try to work with them. One of the great triumphs I had in my career was I gave a talk on beneficial insects on golf courses and using less toxic pesticides on golf courses. And then a day or two later, I got a phone call from a golf course superintendent who had treated his greens for some pest cutworms, and he saw dead spiders on the green, and he was all upset, and he wanted to know if he'd like completely ruined his ecological balance on his golf course. And we talked about that, but at least he was thinking about it.
I say for me, with my neighbors, in my neighborhood, I'm the bug lady. So everybody's sending me pictures or bringing samples of insects over to my house. And I just try to explain to people, what this insect is and if it's a benefit or a detriment. And, sometimes there are just insects that are just, they're not either, they're just out there. So I just try and do a lot of education, specifically insect by insect. The next question is, can we get your contact info? And I just wanted to double check with you that it's okay that I give out your contact info.
That's fine. I said I'm going up to visit my former student, Adam, the monarch butterfly student at Davy Tree tomorrow, and going to see their corporate headquarters and such. So I'll be out of the office for the next 2 days after today, but then I'll be back early next week. So if I don't write, and I have a funeral and a wedding on the weekend, so if I don't write back to you right away, that's why. But I will write back to you if you contact me, I promise.
We definitely understand that it's a busy time of year and you're a busy person. So I have a couple of acres and I'm tempted to turn it into pollinator fields, but our property is surrounded by commercial soy, winter wheat, and corn fields that are sprayed. Is it a good or bad idea to attract pollinators to this area where they may be exposed to the other fields as well?
Well, that's another one where just as a little old entomologist sitting in my office doing small plot research with grad students, that's a tough one. I mean, I would go for it. Soybeans and those other field crops, they don't bloom for very much of the year. And, maybe you'll save a lot of bees by pulling them over into your property. I'm not sure I would be that concerned about that. I think the benefit would outweigh the cost there, but that's my opinion. Yeah.
So a lot of great presentations. Thank you very much. A lot of those I'm seeing here. Another person says, I think it would be helpful to use the specific term, sorry, it went away, insecticides when talking about chemicals of concern with pollinators instead of the general term pesticides.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Not all pesticides are insecticides, of course. And to my knowledge, there's not a lot of evidence. In fact, I'm not aware of any evidence that, say, the broadleaf herbicides we use, Weed Be Gone, is toxic to bees. I think that, the issues there would be just the fact that we're eliminating some bee habitat with herbicides, but the herbicides themselves, to my knowledge, haven't been shown to be a big bee hazard. Some fungicides can be. Not all insecticides are the same, too. And I mean, that's really important. People, I mean, all the time I see people writing letters to the editor in the local newspaper, condemning pesticides or insecticides. But, we constantly have to educate people that they're not all the same. So I think things are getting much better. I have a slide I give in other talks that show the LD50s of some of the products we used in, say, 1990, Dursban, Diazinon, and some of the other bad apples that were, just a few grains would kill a duck or float a fish. And, we've made a lot of progress with intrinsic toxicity and particularly human toxicity. We're not out of the woods yet, There are at least 2 new anthraquinone diamides coming down the pipe. None of them, as far as I can tell, are quite the magic compound that acelepryn is. They have less toxicity to bees than some of the other products, but they're not quite as bee friendly as acelepryn. So that's the holy grail for every chemical company right now. I'll guarantee you that BASF, Dow, or whatever they are, Corteva these days, and Bayer and Syngenta and all the rest, their organic chemists are back in the lab as we speak, desperately trying to find things that'll kill pests and mosquitoes and such that are pollinator friendly. We're not going to see the registration of very many more pollinator toxic insecticides. There's no future in that. So that's a good thing.
So,
and as you all know, this is a great driver. This pollinator issue is a tremendous driver for conservation and gardening and public education and all of that. So, you know, like the whales and the polar bears and the pandas, use it.
So then the next question is, how toxic are mosquito sprays to dogs and children? So I'm assuming they mean, you know, when it's sprayed on the yard, as to them getting into the, you know, the concentrated product, because concentrated it would be very harmful.
Yeah, that's a good question too. And again, I think I can answer that in an informed way. They're almost all using pyrethroid insecticides, which are your Telstars and Tempos and anything that ends in a thrin, THRIN, as an active ingredient. Those are also found in a lot of the homeowner insecticides over the counter now. Those products should not be inhaled. So, you know, it would take a really terrible mosquito sprayer to be spraying when their kids actually out in the yards, you know, playing and such. We don't want to have any inhalation of the actual spray itself. But once they're applied to surfaces, they're virtually non-dislodgeable. You can apply them to a carpet for fleas, and you know, you could walk around barefoot on the carpet, and they're virtually non-dislodgeable. So once those sprays are dry on the foliage and such, they should really not pose any hazard to people who use the backyard, dogs and children and such. Shouldn't be a problem at all. Just avoid direct contact when it's being sprayed. That's my opinion, but I think the toxicology would you know, I mean, I'm not suggesting that if a kid went out and ate, you know, 5 kilos of freshly treated leaves, that wouldn't be good. But playing in the backyard that was treated for ticks or mosquitoes shouldn't be a hazard once those residues are dry.
And it looks like that's about the last question. Just a lot of thank yous and very helpful talks and great presentations, and really loving your embrace of the white clover as part of the Healthy Lawn.
Yeah, so, I'm writing a paper right now on dwarf clover and white Dutch clover for lawns. And I had an all dwarf microclover lawn for 3 years, and we loved it. The bunnies liked it and the bumblebees liked it. And then we had a harsh winter in 2017, and the clover lawn didn't do well in the winter time. And didn't really come back. It wasn't very wear tolerant, and it made my garage smell like chopped spinach when I mowed it, because it stuck to the bottom of the lawnmower. But we have an enormous bloom of spontaneous white Dutch clover in Lexington right now. It's all over the place. I haven't seen so much clover anywhere. It's just covered with bees, and it's great. So any kind of I mean, people, front yards, okay, I get it that there are people that, you know, don't like the way it looks in their front yard, but there's no reason why you can't encourage it in any kind of low input turf, parks, roadsides, and I think most backyards. Yeah, we need to be encouraging that. And remember, it's not native Dutch white clover, but it is great for bees.
And I just loved that picture that you put from Balmoral there, of the Queen's, of, you know, the Queen's, one of her favorite retreats, and it's got all that clover in the back. So that just I don't know, that made me so happy to see.
If you've traveled in Europe, you know that they have a very different mindset. You know, this monoculture turfgrass perfect lawn thing is a creation of Scots and Camelon and you know, post World War II, you know, man's dominance over the environment mindset and you know, social status and all of that. But you know, you travel in Europe. I went to corporate headquarters of Syngenta in Basel, Switzerland, and they have a mandate that you can't mow your grass until like the 1st of June. And the corporate landscape around Syngenta in Basel is a meadow. You know, it's a wildflower meadow. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, it's going to take a lot to convince the average American to have a wildflower meadow in their front yard. And there are issues with that too. I mean, my hay fever is terrible this year. My seasonal allergies are awful. And so, you know, hey, you know, maybe that wouldn't be so good. You know, I have little grandkids that, you know, could step on bees. I get that. But there's a happy medium here that we can work toward. Just don't make people mad by pounding your fist and being a zealot about it, because again, you know, I've had colleagues at NC State, Stacy, and you might know who some of them are, weed scientists and such, and I say, you know, can't you guys come up with some sort of a solution for weeds other than just another herbicide? How about talking to people about the fact that violets in the yard aren't necessarily the worst thing in the world? And they look at me like I'm a communist, you know, or a socialist or whatever. And how dare you suggest that somebody should have to tolerate violets in their yard, you know? And we get into these discussions, and I realize that you're just going to turn some people off if you just are too far in one way or the other. Try to work with them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Potter. We really, really enjoyed your presentation today, and we just appreciate your time. And there aren't any other questions.
Thanks,
So,
Stacy. I really enjoyed meeting with your group, and let's hope that the next time we can get back to doing these meetings in person, and things are getting better here a little bit at a time. And yeah, very good. Appreciate
wonderful.
your attendance, and appreciate the privilege of your time too.
Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Okay, you take care. See ya.
See ya.